Simon Watson here for No More Rulers. I'm sitting here with a couple of friends, and we're going to talk about Jean-Michel Basquiat and an extraordinary exhibition that is currently running at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And the show is called Writing the Future. I've got the catalog right here. Basquiat and the Hip Hop Generation. And it's been curated by Liz Munsell at the museum and Greg Tate, who is the great music journalist and source of so many essays about crossover between art and culture and music. It is a remarkable exhibition that everybody can view online or in a video. And one of the amazing things about this project of theirs is trying to capture a scene, getting an understanding of not just Jean-Michel, but Jean-Michel being part of a scene in New York in the 80s. And one of the things I was so impressed by was a little talk that Greg Tate gave, and who was talking about the crossover between the music scene in New York, the club scene in the early 80s, and the art scene. And I'd love to hear you guys and your take on then and now. So maybe HAZE, we begin with you, because these are some of your friends, all of your friends at that moment. And what's your impression of it?
You were spot on. I think nightlife was really what connected us. We had a sort of immediate sense of community, but at the same time, we were from different areas of the city and different backgrounds. And, you know, Jean was from Brooklyn, Keith was an out-of-towner, we were Upper West Side kids, and it was really like clubs like the Roxy that embodied uptown meeting downtown, and sort of the intelligentsia meeting the cross-pollinating with the Rocksteady crew and rappers and graffiti artists. And there was this sense of invention, this sense of recognition. We talked earlier about sort of what a wild west the city was in a way we can't really picture now. But just sort of being below 14th Street at that point sort of felt outlaw. Everything felt rough around the edges. And you know, we were sort of each other's sounding board visually or sonically. And you know, if you look at that sort of microcosm of the early 80s, you know, a show we talked about like New York New Wave had Laurie Anderson doing, and David Byrne doing photography. And there was a real sense of sort of simpatico between the mediums, and in a way that I think is very hip hop. We didn't really see the stratas. We didn't see, you know, it's a cliche to say you didn't see color, but there really was a sense of community, and it was localized. You know, we held these open meetings on the Upper West Side with our collective, the Soul Artists, and you know, journalists, museums, other painters, and you know, we were graffiti artists, but we embraced non-graffiti the same way both Keith and Jean uniquely sort of straddled those worlds. They straddled the worlds of the outlaw leaving an imprint on the street in this sort of mysterious countercultural way, but they were also able to straddle the heights of, you know, being at Mr. Chow's with Andy Warhol. You know, these are it was heady stuff and heady days that way, but you know, we touched on earlier, and so did Ferg, it all was sort of a search for identity and a commonality. You know, you talked about the tension between uniqueness and feeling like you belong. So there was a sense of community while there was a imperative to sort of find yourself and shine your uniqueness. And I think, you know, I like to look at things in sort of mirror effects, and energy sort of feeds off each other. And I think that's really what happened. Was there was this sort of implosion, explosion of just creative energy and drive. Um, you know.
What's your first memory of Basquiat when you first met him? Where were you?
You know, I knew of Jean when he went to City as school through other friends, even before he and I had met and became friends. I'm gonna say we first met at the Soul Artist uptown. You know, throughout the journey, I was blessed and fortunate to spend time with Jean in Andy's old building, watching him paint, sort of idiot savant almost, you know. He'd be having a conversation and doing genius shit without looking. And in fact, I actually, I saw Jean again a couple hours before he passed as well, having run into him in Soho, and I had seen and interpreted a new light in his eyes. Like I had seen him through different periods and changes and, you know, highs and lows, always, you know, held in a sort of glorious light. And, you know, the sad final truth to me is that the last time I saw Jean, he looked renewed, and then he was gone.
One of the things that's really so interesting about this exhibition is its timeliness, because, you know, we think about that era and this mix of street art and music, things coming in from outside, invading a space in a way that seemed impossible to enter. And I think one of the interesting things to me, and comments by Greg Tate particularly, have to do with the influence of hip hop and Afrofuturism. And it's really thinking about these injections from different places. And Ferg, I'm curious your take on this today, because, you know, some of these same themes are continuing. I mean, where this exhibition begins and where this sense of inclusion begins continues, I think, today. I mean, what's your impression? I mean, you're a music maker today and an artist. I mean, I'm curious.
I think that, like, if I was 60 now and I was like hanging out back in the times of Basquiat and Andy Warhol and that thing in you, I would be hanging out with y'all.
No doubt.
Because y'all was like you said, y'all was merging the worlds. You know, we got we'll find the skaters, the BMX bike riders, the fashion designers, the artists, and find some like rich accountant dude or like lawyer crib to crash at and have a random party. And that's our world. It's like, you know, kids coming from Harlem, New York, you know, kids, you know, running around Soho all day and night for 2 days straight, same clothes, you know, riding bikes, but then hanging out with like these billionaire kids that's like, you know, wanting to know what's going on in our culture and wanting to go uptown and see what them streets is like, wanting to they want to feel something. Cause my thing is like, you know, their parents is rich and, you know, they've had a great life and ate and you know, they do everything by the book and it's like boring. They need to live life. They see that like, you know, I come from the bottom. I come from, like my mother and my dad, they is middle class, you know, but I come from where like everybody else that was around me is from the bottom. That's who I was hanging out with. And we're forced to make things eventful because we don't have anything. It's like we gotta like take lemons and make lemonade. So that's what makes the great basketball player. That's what makes the great artist. That's what makes the great, when you see these black kids that's shining, that's what makes them great, is because we've always had to been eventful because when we were slaves, we took scraps and made it soul food. Now we have soul food restaurants. You know what I'm saying? So I think that magic of us having an influence and then linking up with the downtown kids to be like, oh, my dad owns this gallery space. And I'm like, oh, I paint. Well, let's do something together. And then it works, and then you keep doing it, and then that's when people evolve and they become who they are. And that's what I think happens.
It's good, and it's a crossover as well, right? I mean, this is about cultures crossing over.
Right.
In such an interesting way. HAZE, can you give us just a capsule description of who you are, your history? Give us the capsule of
The elevator pitch on,
Exactly.
on 50 years?
yeah.
I like to think of my journey and my career in chapters. When I was younger, I sort of rejected the Renaissance man theory. I thought you have to pick a target and excel at that. And so over stages, that's sort of what I did. As a graffiti artist, as a young kid, I wanted to be a king, and that was the focus. And when we felt like we'd accomplished something, we're looking for the next, where's the exit and the next goal? Our first baptism of fire entree into both sort of grown-up responsibility and the art world at the same time was very young for us. We were a cover story in the Village Voice when I was 18 years old, and then we were featured in, the big show at PS1 in '81 when I was 19, maybe 20. So we didn't understand the concept that there were different playing fields yet, I think. Like, we figured, okay, we were artists, now we had to, this is the gallery world, fun gallery, We understood who Gagosian was while we also understood what fun gallery was on lower rungs. But as in our earlier talk, I took a look at my sort of skill set and passion and where I'd come from midstream, and I decided that the written word, communication through typography and graphic design was something very sort of, was a thread that ran through everything I'd done. So I chose that, and I chose to sort of split the atom. We were still bombing trains afternoons and nights and weekends, but I was going to school of visual arts, developing my portfolio, trying to get my weight up so that when I entered the workforce, my skills were top notch. And after that process, I launched into graphic design and opened my own design studio. And for the better part of a decade, that was my focus of excellence of typography and art direction. And after a while, I realized, I was still kind of packaging other people's ideas. As an album cover designer, I was packaging music. I wasn't the end result. I didn't have control of the final message. So I returned to seeking how I could turn that mirror around, and fortunately, having sort of broke out to California for both personal and professional reasons, I was in the epicenter of streetwear when that became the hot medium. So sort of in these chapters and decades, I've gone from graffiti to fine art to graphic design to product, and then at a certain point I realized, I don't want to turn into a clothing company. That's not where I was really headed. So I decided to level out that playing field and sort of reposition myself in relation to the world, that we were an art and design based company that also put out product. And once I sort of was more relaxed about it with myself, and we talked earlier about these lines and divisions of mediums and cultures sort of blurring as we enter the new millennium, I realized, I've sort of done this Bruce Lee studying each discipline, and now I've got it all in pocket enough that I could step back, take the bits and pieces that work for my own personal style, and that's how I proceed now, sort of post 50, with like the ability to wear different hats and different arenas and playing field. And to your point too earlier, I just stopped overthinking it. I stopped overthinking what I should be doing in relation to one thing or another, and just decided if that's authentically what I woke up in the morning either wanting to do or had a responsibility to do. I still balance this world between problem solving and the commerce of graphic design and collaborations, be they with fashion brands or other artists. But over the last 10, 15 years, I've returned to the playing field of painting, galleries, and fine art, and also carved out that place for myself that the pandemic was wonderful for, where if the phone wasn't ringing and I didn't have a deadline and I didn't know anybody, any work, I had a space where I could go and still be productive on my own terms with my own, work from my head inside out. And that's where I've landed at 60 is, sort of happily addressing whatever comes my way. And, if again, to Ferg's point, there's opportunities and there's opportunities. Some opportunities, have a carrot dangling, but you don't know how you're going to feel like on the other side of that bridge.
One of the really interesting things about this exhibition is that it has a soundtrack. There is a 36-song playlist put together by Greg Tate and some of the artists who are participating in the show. And it's really interesting to think about music enlivening a cultural space. I've never heard of a museum exhibition with a soundtrack before. It plays while you're walking around. Some of the walls, the installations are blackened walls as though you're in a nightclub, which is where some of this work was made as well. I'm curious, Ferg, if you would, first of all, introduce yourself as your defining characteristics, and also thinking about art and culture and music as a soundtrack.
I'm A AP Ferg, a musician, an artist overall of different mediums. And creating music is the soundtrack of life, because we're just reporters and, of what's going on in current events. Like, we just talk about what we see, literally. Like, what else can you talk about? It's like what you see and what you envision. You can have visions, you can have dreams, you can have nightmares. You can paint your dreams, you can paint your nightmares. You can rap about and write about your dreams or your nightmares, or I could write about this conversation we just had. So nothing is like out of whack. It all comes from you. And that is the soundtrack of your life, which it is the soundtrack for a whole generation, because you're not the only one going through it. If you're an honest person and you be true to yourself, and everybody in your generation and in your life is gonna really be able to relate to what you're talking about in that soundtrack, because we're all going through it. There's no such thing as one person going through something. Everybody's going through something, and you'll be surprised there's a lot of people going through the same thing that you're going through. So I think that's what a soundtrack to life is.
The exhibition, sort of, as well as having Basquiat, has about a dozen other artists, and certainly for me, one of the keynotes is Ramel Z, who in so many ways was a performer, as much as a painter, a performance artist, wearing costumes, etc. It makes me think about, for your role in our culture today as a performance artist. I mean, you're really exploring these areas, and it sort of picks up a thread. And how do you feel about that? I mean, you're a poet, you write, you perform.
Well, I feel really good about it, because I knew that I was a performance artist when I started making music, and I took it serious. I always would want to dress like the movie or the videos I seen. And it wasn't necessarily like the chill videos, like very like down to earth outfits. It'd be like the crazy Hype Williams videos with the shiny suits and like, looking like you know, a character like Busta Rhymes with the colors and the brightness, very animated. And that's how like I look in the street. It's so funny because I was just talking about this earlier, like people walk in the street and they, you know, I would say normal people because I feel like I'm abnormal because I have vision. When I dress, people may not even understand where my head is at when I dress sometimes because I am so beyond where we are right now. Like I am eons ahead. I'm like thinking for the next generations to come. And I don't want to look like none of y'all. So I'm like just being uniquely myself. So that in a way is being a performer. Like I'm performing for people. And then once you do it, you set a trend where people can then start doing it. And then it becomes a thing. Like I got a knack, and I had a knack for this since I was a younger guy. Before I was a teenager, like I was in junior high school, and I remember like really like going back and forth with myself between wearing big baggy jerseys because we went through that phase, and wearing more slim and tailored fit jeans like the Dominican hustlers in Harlem. So I would go back and forth, like, do I wear Diesel and 7 or do I stick to like the basketball like jerseys and fitteds? And I was like, to your point, I just stopped arguing with myself in that duality and trying to stick in one realm and just allow myself to be. And just really start paying attention to the present moment and how I felt that present moment and start dressing accordingly. And that's what I feel like you become something truly unique because nobody's one way. It's when we start mixing these ways, it's when we start curating our life and become something super unique and original.
So what's the next step?
Clothing line, curating art shows with my own art visually, and other artists providing a platform. More music, of course. More music that I'm listening to from like younger people, and just really lending a hand because I've been in the game for 10 years. I'm young, I'm still young, but I'm a veteran at this point. I'm way past the one-hit wonder, and I have so much energy and I'm charged up and ready to take on new challenges. So I think I'm gonna be just doing this forever. Like I just wanna continue to create with all mediums, not just music, but art, fashion, giving back however I can. You know what I'm saying? Culinary arts, because I believe that our tribe runs throughout all different arts. Even the way people think, you could be like a lawyer, a doctor, a nurse, or fireman, or a businessman. Strategy is an artistic way of thinking. Some people win better or more. LeBron is an artist, the way he wins all the time. That's an art to win like that. So it's all mindset. Art is just a mindset.
I know recently you were looking at some Keith Haring drawings. You were at Sotheby's, and you were responding to those. Whose work interests you a lot at the moment?
At the moment,
For visual artists.
visual artists who inspire me and who is really moving me at the moment is my friend Haji. He's really taken New York and the world by storm. Doing a lot, like coming really from like the gritty streets and like being like downtown and like all of the inner city kids that's really like going in and out of his studio and like working with him, like big brands like Adidas, Pumas, and Subi that he's worked with. We did a jersey together, a New York Knicks jersey for the Garden. We did a custom jersey that we put out and released. He shot a few videos for me. His style is just like super unorthodox. In fact, it reminds me a bit of Basquiat. Like he has a bit of that DNA of sporadicness, and like I'm doing 100 things at one time in his work. Like when Basquiat said, I'm like got the TV on, I have the radio on, I'm like reading a book, and I'm painting Like, that's a stream of consciousness. That's just how he is. So that's how it comes out in his work. And Haji is really tapped in with that. And then you have Reginald, which is like this super, I would say, strong dude that is, you know, tapping into the ancestry realm and like really like taking the spirit of that and putting it on canvas in a very abstract style, which is super dope. And it's like, I always ask someone, how can you make abstract feel black when it's abstract? And that's the best way I could describe what his work is like. It's abstract, but you could just tell a black man did it with a plight and a mission. Then you have Jalil, which is a super dope artist from LA. And he speaks a whole nother type of language. Is character driven. I like to say, like, you know, like how Asian typography, or like the language, I don't know how to say it, but like how Egyptians have hieroglyph and they use like different images to like tell a story or make a sentence. To me, he has his own hieroglyph. And when you look at his hieroglyph, those faces is all lines that either look like real faces drawn out or cartoons. So it's just like his style and just like the energy in his artwork is just next level, and he's really pushing it forward on just really taking a canvas art to a whole nother place. Like, how can you make abstract look digital? Because digital is computer and internet based, right? But he gives you a sense of digital and a futuristic space within his work, but it also bridges the gap between humans and the human race. So those are the guys that I'm really like looking at and excited about.
What you were just saying made me think about what I've seen of your drawings and lyrics in your sketchbook. And I wonder if you think about how it looks as you're writing, I mean, the lyrics, the way you write them, you cut them out. There are things that are put in the sides. Do you think of those as compositions, or, I mean, they act that way to me in some ways.
I tried to get out of my head about how I'm gonna do it, because then that just becomes aesthetic, and I wanna really get out of aesthetic to create a real aesthetic. To me, aesthetic is just who you are. Oh, that's some shit Ferg would do. That's an aesthetic. But I don't want it to become composition while I'm writing or putting down my art, because then I'm only doing what I've seen before. And that, whatever I've seen before is Basquiat crossing out the word, or whatever the case may be. I'll be doing what Basquiat did.
But you're cutting out lyrics that you didn't like.
Yeah, naturally. Maybe that's a scribble and not a line, but that's something Ferg would do. Basquiat did a line, Ferg would scribble it out until I don't see it anymore. So it don't even exist. I don't even want people, what I do think about is when I'm dead and gone, who's gonna find that book and what they're gonna see when they see that. And if I didn't want them to read that word or line, I'm gonna make sure they never see it. So I'm scribbling and scrabbling it out. And that's my aesthetic.
Which speaks to history. I mean, HAZE, you have said that yourself about thinking about, you know, projecting forward with work. Did you feel that at that moment? I mean, we're talking about this exhibition in Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and I'm curious, knowing that whole circle in the late 70s and early 80s, there's a sense of revolution and just striking things, but did you also have the sense of history and things were changing?
Yes, and you know, remember the introduction of AIDS into our community, radically upped the ante of what felt transitory in our lives. If we sort of understood as humans to begin with that, that nothing was guaranteed, and I think we all sort of, I'd like to think a common thread with all artists is a sense of leaving something behind. We're all very conscious of our mortality, and art gives us an immortality that we couldn't otherwise achieve.
We make it beautiful.
So
When we leave, it looks really good.
but at the same time, and you touched on it, we're here 30, 40 years later discussing the dynamic of then. So we're also conscious that 30, 40 years from now, there will be other people discussing this dynamic, and that it's all sort of a chain of being, a chain of creativity that way. But I think to your point, yes, we were all, and especially graffiti, was sort of designed to be here today, gone tomorrow, and buffed. And even in as much as there was no internet and there was no sort of world space to communicate, it was a dialogue of the moment. I think you were talking about too, that sort of, if we could appreciate what each other was doing, it existed. It had validity. If it grew and snowballed or became embraced on a larger sense, as Jean and Keith ultimately were, I think the voice that Jean was using was the same in success as it was in anonymity. And again, it speaks to sort of that fundamental truth of authenticity. And I may have gone on a tangent from the original question, but it was, we were each other's sort of mirror, as you said. That I think it's one of the things I've always said, and we've seen examples, positive and negative. As an artist, you need honest voices around you. You need people to pull your card. You need people to tell you like you're not trying hard enough when they can see it, things like that. And I think as a community, we were that for each other. We applauded each other and risk and reward, and it was a culture, it was a community of individuality, and that was,
That's so nicely said. I love that.
That was the, in a way, that's the goal. If you could rise and shine, and people say, "Yo, that's Ferg's style. That ain't nobody else's style. That's Ferg." Then you really, then you've created the platform. And we talked about it earlier, and you were saying something similar, that I never looked at starting a brand or a clothing company as the end goal. It was sort of, I did clothing so I could arrive in a position where I could also do furniture, I could also do jewelry, I could also do other things. So
now let me ask you a question. You could be a starving artist or an artist that make money. How did you get to the point where you was making money off of your art? And without sacrificing your integrity and playing yourself?
I think my experience is a little sort of unique because I ended up embracing commercialism to succeed in a way that I felt I could be, I could self-empower myself in terms of goals and aspirations in a way that the fine art world doesn't necessarily, you can't skip steps in the fine art world, right?
Would you say that Keith Haring did similar things?
Absolutely.
The pop shop?
Yes, and we before you arrived, we were talking about it, that Keith actually offered me my very first sort of commercial opportunity, that I was uniquely the only other person who sold t-shirts and stickers in the pop shop. Like, I did my first HAZE t-shirts just for the pop shop. And then, I got a little skateboard account in California and this and that. And that was about 5 years before I said, you know what, I'm gonna make a go of this as a brand and in the clothing business. But
And then how did you feel like once you start seeing your counterparts make it? You start seeing like, you know, Gagosian took Basquiat in, gave him opportunities to show his work, and his stuff was going. Now he's eating caviar and driving around in limos. When you seen this, the same guy that, you know, was in the streets running around with you and everything, he took it to that level.
yes and no. And the interesting thing about both Jean and Keith is that they managed to successfully both play sort of the high ground and the low ground without
Being
sort of
weird.
faking one or the other. And they, you know, Keith primarily took a lot of heat in the beginning for the pop shop of like, you know, on face value, like you're selling six-figure paintings to museums. How can you sell stickers for $1 at the same
He
time?
allowed
But you
himself
can.
to. He
You
allowed
can.
himself just to flow. He didn't overthink it.
Right, and you know, we are, you certainly in the millennial generation, but we are the embodiment of that flexibility, where you have created a platform with music that allows you to do fashion art and all this other things, or I, you know, sort of created a design studio that allowed me to pivot into branding, which allowed me to become a collaborator in all kinds of different spaces I might not have imagined to begin with.
Did their success empower you to be like, oh, I can do that? Because I know when I first seen Virgil be like the first black heterosexual man to be creative director of one of the biggest, if not the biggest, brand, and with like LVMH, Louis Vuitton, like that just showed me like a world of things. Because when I was coming up, like I would get like hounded on, like I'm talking about from my family, like why are you watching fashion shows or this, that, and the third, or we would get into fights because we was called gay for wearing different clothes. It's like, how can you be gay from the clothes you wear? I don't get that. But now it's super normal. Like it's like a blurred line with that, and that's because of Virgil getting that stance, and like Kanye and taking that stance, and Pharrell and ASAP, my crew, we was like the guys. I was like, we're from the hood, but we're so eclectic in the way we think with art, music, fashion, this, that, and the third. We know about this, we know about that, and we're gonna wear it. We wasn't afraid to be ourselves. Now it's so normal to be like this, but like if I had this outfit on back in the days, we would like get into a fight off of words, like, and disrespectful things. We made it okay in a way. We validated it, and kids now can be themselves. And do you feel that way, like looking at like what Keith did and what Basquiat did, that you was like, oh, they did it, they was fully themselves and they made it happen. I'm from the same tribe, like I'm just gonna keep pushing the envelope.
Again, yes and no, because I feel I've located and figured out some things later in life that were sort of elusive to me at that time. And one of them was, and this is sort of a grand admission, I realized some of my best friends were some of the greatest painters of the generation. And it was hard to feel like you measured up and wanted to be a painter too, right? Like they're man enough to admit later in life, there was probably a little seed of doubt planted in my brain as my future and aspirations as a painter, because I stood in the shadows of such immeasurable greatness, right? So in some ways, yes, you know, Keith was such a free spirit and dressed the way he dressed, and he was like the embodiment of like, you know, the kid in the candy store, and it's all good. He was just super cool and having super fun and doing cool shit. End of story. Whereas, you know, I probably if I look back, you know, I was overthinking things, or, you know, what did choices amount to, and all. I wasn't just letting it happen. And maybe I chose graphic design because there was an element of control there that I couldn't find in the fine art world. So, in a weird way, yes.
But really extended your writing in the streets. I mean,
I found my comfort zone ultimately. But to your point, they were both true. That here were these magnificent, soaring, free, unique spirits with just the hands of God. But at the same time, you knew you had to find your own lane. Those were magnificent lanes, but those were not the lanes you were going to travel.
Do you believe that most greats have short-lived lives, and it's made to be that way?
No, I actually feel, you know, and Keith and John are the exception because they just had such phenomenally productive short lives. You know, I like to think the difference between greatness or really good and truly great is sustain. You know, it's like you said, you're not a one-hit one. You're so far past a one-hit wonder, you don't have to ask yourself that question anymore. You just make the album.
I don't have to wonder.
Right? And I finally arrived at that point where, like, you know, got enough under your belt that, you know, tomorrow's got to be a victory lap. It's not a challenge.
How old was Keith and Basquiat when he passed away?
31
and I think Basquiat was 28.
Yeah,
wow,
he was a little younger.
I was thinking that they passed at a young age because they was taking in so much energy and they had so much energy to give that they ultimately burned themselves out. I think the fact that you sustained so long, and the fact that I sustained so long, because even a lot of my friends has passed away, is because they didn't know how to balance or deal with life as it came.
Know the ledge, right?
They didn't know the ledge. So Basquiat, it was drugs, and Keith Haring, it was AIDS. But both things is kind of like, there's a ledge, right? It's like they went over the ledge a little bit, and then, do you think that mentally the pressures that was coming at them, or mentally everything that was coming at them, that they resorted to the ledge? And
Jean more so than Keith, to be honest.
Okay.
Yes. And there's one thing that.
Well, we're living in a moment of a horrifying health crisis with the pandemic, and AIDS was equally a horrifying health crisis, and that was denied by the government. And, you know, I mean, these
so
complications are horrifying. And, you know, they're embedded in these stories and these moments are these social political issues that, you know, through homophobia and denial, AIDS moved forward and destroyed so much. President Reagan, who was in power for 8 years, never uttered the word AIDS. I mean, that's how invisible the crisis was.
Right.
So, you know, we live in a moment of pandemic, and you see some of these social political issues playing out again. And it you know, people who deny a virus, right?
Right.
Well, there are ways
there
are ways to fight a health crisis.
Right.
And there are ways to pretend and ignore. And
Right.
I think, you know, there is a social and a political dimension to this exhibition that we've been talking about, but also to this moment. And I think it's very important that art and culture and all of us, you know, face up to this.
Right.
Critical.
I totally agree.
Yeah, that's valid.
I felt like this was sort of this pandemic was sort of the 80s squared. The next level of that unfortunate game.
Yeah.